This backdrop's going to seem real ironic once you watch the video. Read on. What is up, everybody? Welcome back to Fontanalis. I took a little break there. I was getting tired of making diet videos because this is a philosophy channel, and to be frank, there's a lot of negativity in diet, which is a really weird thing to say, that it's so politicized and so religious, if you will. So, ironically, this video is sort of parapolitical in its nature, but I think you can get past that. It's two things that nobody ever talks about when talking about global warming. So, disclaimer, my personal view on global warming, it exists, it is anthropogenic, but here's a couple points I'm going to make that I think people who are not so with the whole global warming camp can get behind. So, the first is something I've literally heard no one bring up, but it's the first thing that I ever thought of when I started thinking about global warming. So, fill or complete this sentence. Every process that produces CO2 also produces blank. The sun. That's the sun. Every process that produces CO2 also produces heat. When we're burning fossil fuels, when we are burning calories in our bodies, all of these things produce heat. In fact, that's one of the primary purposes of a lot of these processes. We burn fossil fuels to heat our homes, we burn calories to heat our bodies. So the fact that heat and carbon dioxide are associated should surprise no one. Because even if there is no greenhouse gas effect to having CO2 in the atmosphere, everything that produces CO2 produces heat. So naturally, there's going to be some amount of alignment in that trend. Okay? And the second thing that I think I've heard a couple permaculturalists mention this point. Okay, this second point is a little more difficult to talk about concisely, but essentially it's the difference between what happens when sunlight hits a plant versus when that sunlight strikes barren ground or rotting material. So the primary reason this is important to think about is because our agricultural systems, plant-based agriculture, strips photosynthesizing material off of land. When you practice modern conventional agriculture, you're putting seeds in the ground and letting plants grow for maybe 6 months out of the year. And then the rest of that time, the soil is barren. What happens when sunlight hits that soil? Or if you leave it fallow, what happens when sunlight hits that material? It turns into heat. That sunlight is not being converted into anything, right? It hits the ground and it just gets dispersed as heat. So now both the very surface of the soil and the air above it are getting a higher increment of heat from the sun. But what happens when you have photosynthesizing material, chlorophyll, chloroplasts on the soil? Well, what happens is that sunlight hits those chloroplasts and it's converted into stored energy. Ergo, rather than producing heat, it produces a potential for heat. And then that energy, that stored energy source in those carbohydrates, is pumped partially into the soil. So in other words, instead of producing heat above the ground, we're producing complexity and life below the ground. This is why the soils are such an important carbon sink, and it's a huge part of why we have so much more heat and so much more carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. We are stripping the land of its natural, permanent plant culture and replacing it with barren ground which does nothing but produce heat. We need to be putting permanent crops on our land. We need to be cover cropping, we need to be practicing permaculture, because then all that heat which would go into further warming the globe and warming the air, it's being converted into something useful. It's being converted into life, okay? So we need to make sure that we have deep, abundant soils by keeping that chloroplastic material above the ground. And I'm sure I'm going to make a lot more videos about permaculture and optimizing the amount of output that we get from the same inputs, agriculture in general. But that's basically what I wanted to say in this video. I just kind of wanted to have fun, talk about some things that I enjoy talking about instead of just sticking on this same old diet train. So if you want to see more agricultural videos, more videos like this, give me a like, maybe leave a comment about something you'd like to hear me talk about, and of course, I would love it if you subscribed, and I will see you next time.